Hello and welcome. Recently, many of us have been noticing a trend amongst the leaders that we, generally speaking, have to pay attention to, because those leaders are responsible for many things that impact our lives, for many things that impact our well-being, our not so well-being, the economy, business, trade, trade in the country, trade abroad. They impact our security, they impact our relations with other countries, and right down to will the grass across the road from you that the council takes care of or should take care of get cut, and so on. So it is, I believe, really important to zone in, to focus in on those people who are in positions of power and influence. And I've talked about them for years. It's not just politicians. We could, of course, look to the community leaders. Are they ethical? Are they moral? We could also look to sport. There are sometimes scandals in sport because of coaches who are maybe a former leader, and certainly managers. And also, we find ourselves in a situation where we can have people in small businesses but also big corporations, and both of them in different ways can have a fairly big impact, a fairly huge impact. And so I think, as I've said before, it is important to look at these individuals. It is important to check these individuals out, to pay close attention to them, to listen to what they say they're going to do, and then pay close attention to the real tell, which is their behaviors. What do they actually do? What are they actually doing day to day, week to week? What is their direction of travel? Has the rhetoric, has the story changed gradually, subtly, in a way that you're not meant to notice? So why say all that? Apart from, I think it's important, as I've hopefully laid out, because whether we like it or not, the the people who are in these positions, not all of them, but a percentage, a reasonable percentage, are going to be individuals who are part of what's known as the Dark Triad. How do I know that? I know that not because I'm saying everybody that goes into politics or becomes a CEO is has more than their average share of Dark Triad traits. Not actually what I mean at all. What I mean is that in any given population, you will find people with that dark triad, all of them sometimes, and certainly one, in a reasonable level of percentage in terms of that population. Now, there are a lot of, I suppose, different perspectives on how high those levels are. It's difficult to tell because we're not necessarily talking about people who are extreme on one end. They may have slightly above average, and that may vary across time. It may vary across situation. So we've got to be careful with generalizations. We've got to be careful with headlines that we see, that we hear, that we read. And because of that, it is, I believe, difficult to say, if not ultimately impossible, accurately, but we can take a best guess. And that guess is that we will have, whether we like it or not, people in these jobs, in these roles of great influence. And of course, recently, many of us have been talking about and commenting on politicians. A fair amount of those people will share some of these traits that, or have some of these traits, and some of them are quite similar to each other, it would seem, that we would consider to be above the norm, to the extent that it could be harmful to those people that they purport to lead. So I probably at this juncture should mention the Dark Triad. Then you've probably heard of it, but let's refresh our memories. Dark Triad: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. Machiavellianism, when it is a trait that is considered to be above the norm and therefore potentially dangerous to the people around the Machiavellian operative, not necessarily, but could be, is of course something we need to pay attention to in politics. It would seem is going to be a happy hunting ground for the Machiavellian type. And of course, what is that type? It's someone who will scheme, who will plot, who will hide in the shadows, slither around in the long grass until the time is right to strike. They will vie for position and favour. And the key is that when it is a toxic trait, they don't care about other people. They're low in empathy. In other words, they are able to turn off anything that might allow them to step into someone else's shoes, or as some people suggest, they just don't have that ability in the first place. They literally don't feel in the way that, let's say, the majority of the population might feel. You look at someone, they're in pain, they're suffering, you can pick up on that. And that is called affective empathy. And that affective empathy is incredibly important for social cohesion, if you think about it. The tribe needed it to survive. For the human species to survive in the past, they needed to hunt in groups, to live in groups. Yes, there are exceptions, of course, but weak, slow, rubbish claws, rubbish teeth compared to the other predators, humans were easy meat, literally. But the way they could survive was by banding together and giving them the capacity of numbers to utilize that so-called intelligence, although sometimes you wonder, so-called greater intelligence compared to most, if not all, of the other creatures on the planet. And because humans to survive needed to be tribal, then it was an asset to the tribe if people could look at someone who was hurting, not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, and do something about it, bond, make friendship, allegiances, and that made, or could make, wouldn't always, the tribe, the group, more efficient and stronger. So empathy is important across the board in also many different ways. Specifically here, I'm suggesting that the Machiavellian type doesn't sort of feel that. But what they can do is they can pretend. They can pretend that, hey, I actually care. I'm looking at that individual. I can see they're in a bit of distress. It'll look good if I walk across and say, do you need any help with that? I saw you were distressed. I'm very upset about that myself, and I see you're suffering and I want to help. But the Machiavellian may well be doing that because they know that the boss or someone who they want to curry favor with is watching, is listening. So it is often, although not always, about maneuvering and making themselves look as good as possible to get where they want to get to, which is not always greater power. It's not always position. But if you can imagine, if you have someone in a business, in politics, and they are of that ilk, a Machiavellian type with no empathy, then they are maneuvering all the time. It doesn't mean to say that they would necessarily be bad company. What it means, in fact, they could be great company because they may want to be charming, you, me, other people. But what it does mean is that in terms of the buffers that we would sort of bounce away from as we go along and we think, oh my goodness, that's gone too far. I feel bad about that. They don't care. Or they don't care in the same way. It's more calculated. There's less emotion, more cognition is perhaps the way to think about it. Number two in the Dark Triad, in no particular order, is going to be the narcissist. And this is one of these words and I suppose variations of the word that you hear or we have heard more and more these days, a narc, a narcissist. And a lot of people don't quite get that right because it's easy to bandy around. It sounds quite, it's quite insulting potentially. It's meant to be, but there are different types of narcissists. I won't go into that here, but narcissism generally, just like Machiavellianism, most of us are on that scale. It's when it becomes too toxic, as we might think is toxic. Not necessarily the individual who's doing it thinks it's toxic. So too toxic in the sense that, wow, those behaviours are, they're way, way, way out of order. They are socially unacceptable. So, for example, the Machiavellian will do something that is there literally to look good, and this is a repetitive behavior. They don't care about anyone else, and over time you probably would spot it, or you may spot it. Same, but by the way, that doesn't mean to say that you and I cannot do the same thing. That you and I are immune to saying, hey, I'm going to look good in that situation, that makes me feel good. But it's more how often and to what extent and to how ruthless and without empathy an individual is, which would sort of define them in broad terms to be in that area of a Machiavellian personality trait, shall we call it, that could be destructive to the people around them. And same thing, narcissism. It has been argued that most people have an element of narcissism. You go out and you say, I'll buy that thing because when I wear it, I think it'll suit me, or I want that car. How good am I going to look driving that particular car if I win that award, and so on. And one could argue strongly that that's healthy competition, a need to strive to better ourselves. And I think it is. I think it absolutely is. But when the narcissist is behaving in a way, again, with a low opinion of those people around them because they think that they are superior, and I'm thinking here about grandiose narcissism, then that can also have its issues in terms of the work environment and in terms of those people in power. And over time, gradually you can begin to spot them. These people who think they're better than everyone else. These people in that also Machiavellian way who just do what they need to do to make themselves look good. So you can see that those two things can run together. They don't necessarily, but they can. And also then we get on to the third part of the Dark Triad, and that is this, again, well-known word these days, psychopath. So psychopathy. And psychopathy, a psychopath, is, of course, not always, very rarely connected to people who are out there as, serial unalivers and all that thing. It's not that by and large. The psychopathic, again, it is argued we're all on a spectrum. We're all somewhere in there, but people with defined psychopathic traits that we'd have to be aware of, that they maybe should be aware of themselves, are those people for whom it is logic, it is consideration. There is no empathy. Once more, so the Machiavellian, generally speaking, low empathy. The narcissist. Let's just stick with grandiose for the moment and not overcomplicate it. Generally, low empathy. People are beneath them. The psychopath, low empathy. They don't care. They can do things. But they can seem charming, and they can turn emotion on and off. But it's not real in the sense you and I would think about it. It's there to manipulate. Not all psychopaths want to manipulate. A trend, a trait that seems to run through different types of individuals could be defined as psychopaths based on tests is that they tend not to have empathy, feelings in the same way. They can work out how someone may be feeling. They can talk to an individual in a way that may sound like they know how they're feeling, as can the Machiavellian, as can the narcissist, but the psychopath isn't feeling it. Again, some studies have suggested that psychopaths don't experience fear, don't feel fear in the same way, which allows them to be effective in some situations. I remember speaking to a guy in the military and the States a few years ago. We just got into a conversation about it, and we were talking about a person in business that I knew, and I said I think they're a narcissist, and this guy who was getting pretty high up, and in this sort of psychology area, and he said, "Oh, he's a psychopath," and the point is, both can be correct, but he was talking about that because I've read it and it was interesting to get it, from someone from the horse's mouth, so to speak. And he was saying, but think about it. In certain situations, that that individual is useful because if they're wired a certain way, they're not feeling those emotions and can focus on the task at hand. And so it's not to paint people who are psychopaths as bad at all. A lot of them are absolutely not, and we mustn't jump at the word. And imagine Hannibal Lecter, um, and and yet there are people who have those traits who can do damage, which brings me around then to talking about leaders and leadership. And this is what I'm getting to, that dark triad, those people. And it can be a cluster, it can be the three things. It doesn't have to be, but it can be the three things because there's overlap if you think about it. Let's start off with low empathy. And by the way, spoiler, I'm going to get to people who do have empathy but can fall into that triad, which is a fairly recent take on this. And it's kind of something we've really got to pay attention to. But anyway, for the moment, generally speaking, low empathy, no empathy, lower empathy. So they're not putting themselves in the shoes of other people, these people in that dark triad. What they're doing, however, or what they can do, is practice cognitive empathy. So they can say to themselves, if I were in your shoes, I'd probably be thinking this, 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 and this. It's calculated. It can be quite a sort of detailed process that they go through with a lot of subtleties and nuances, but it is mechanical. They're not falling into the same emotions. They're not experiencing those emotions in the same way. They're not able emotionally to step into someone else's shoes, but they can sort of figure it out. They can triangulate it and go, oh, well, cost of living like that, problems over here with, let's say, immigration, to mention something that a lot of the population, and certainly quite a few of the politicians, talk about these days. So they can triangulate that and go, so you probably are feeling this, not feeling it myself, you're probably feeling this. And so a good thing to say would be XYZ. Or if you're tuning in from the States, XYZ. Is there no beginning to my talents? I hear you say. So we have this group, this triad. Again, it can come as a group, it can come as a triad within one individual. There's certainly overlap, but some individuals favour one particular strategy over another. But by and large, until recently, it was thought that what you get are people who don't have empathy. They cannot step into the shoes emotionally of other people and really kind of feel what they feel, albeit an attenuated level of the emotion, but enough to go, oh, I can imagine being in that situation. It must be awful. Let me go and help. Let me go and do something about that. Instead, what we have are people who may say the right things, but my goodness, it's mechanical. And over time, and you might see this in the workplace, you might have seen it in a relationship, you can see it's calculated. You can see that something's not quite right. We're all pretty good at that when we trust our intuition, aren't we? And the big mistakes we make is when we don't trust our intuition. So what we have are people who just, there's something about them. It always reminds me of the Terminator in the movies. And the dogs would bark to tell them that it was a mechanoid, it wasn't an actual person. And the dogs knew for whatever reason. And it's almost like that's like our intuition with some of these people. You just know they're not being genuine. the dog's barking in your head. You know they're lying. You know they don't actually care. You know they're disingenuous. You know they're not sincere. You know that they are ultimately imperious, and you literally mean nothing or very little to them unless you can help them get where they want to get to. So that's so far a synopsis of the Dark Triad, Machiavellian, narcissist, and I'm sticking to grandiose, feeling superior for the moment, just not to complicate it, and then the psychopath. Then we have the fact that they are in every population, pretty much, as far as we understand it, and also that they will not necessarily do any harm at all. Up until recently, the general trend, consensus is probably the better word, was that they did not have empathy. And so that's why you could see they were different. That's why they would behave when unguarded in a different way. And that's also how they could manipulate, because they can calculate how you might be feeling, but without getting dragged into emotions that might overpower them. They break down in tears and say, how can I possibly ever think about doing this to this individual? This is awful. They can rise above it. Particularly so, it is suggested, of course, the psychopath. So then, where does that leave us? It leaves us in an interesting situation with the with the politicians, with the business leaders. I'm not suggesting, and heaven forfend that this was remotely accurate, because I don't think it is, that every politician, every business leader out there, every chief exec has one or two or three of the Dark Triad traits in what we might consider to be toxic quantities. What I am suggesting is that without a shadow of a doubt, they are there. Statistically speaking, it would be highly improbable that when we look at politicians across the board in other countries, in the UK, of course, and also look at big business and small business, that there will not be a smattering, a percentage of people in there who have one, two, or three of these Dark Triad traits at levels that would be considered to be above the norm, and therefore potentially problematic to those around them, which would include us, the population. The population affected by big business, affected also by the politicians, and goodness me, affected by potentially partnerships behind the scenes between big business and politicians. But that is also only part of the story, because relatively recently, according to some research, there is some evidence to suggest that let's start with psychopaths, some psychopaths can experience a level of empathy, meaning that not only can they look at someone's situation and say, that must be bad. What I should say in this situation is, how can I help you? Like the Terminator, like a robot almost, to use that analogy. But that some can feel it to a degree, can have affective empathy, as opposed to just cognitive empathy. And this would seem to apply potentially to the Machiavellian and to the narcissist. But to focus specifically on the psychopath, imagine what that then means. You've got someone who has a tendency to not care, has a tendency to practice superficial charm, to get what they want to do, often to manipulate, but not necessarily in any way that it might bother you or worry you, but that can be what they may be up to. But it can also be at a level that it is deceitful, it's dishonest, and it ultimately harms you, me, and other people, that manipulation. And so they can do that with, it would seem, a level of understanding of how the other person feels, that they can step into the shoes. But obviously something's got to be different. Again, the research is ongoing, in my opinion, because for them to still be mapped and measured on the psychopathic scale towards the end of being uncaring, interested more about themselves, less about other people. And we can see here the overlap to narcissism as well, particularly grandiose, and also to Machiavellianism. Then what we can have are individuals who still are different in the sense that they're not feeling perhaps in quite the same way. And again, the research is ongoing. I'm very interested in it because what it means is that there's a potential subset of those people who would be in that dark triad who can have effective, not just cognitive empathy, meaning that, I hate to say it, but meaning my interpretation that in many ways they could be actually even more skilled at manipulation. They could be even more skilled at saying what they think you and I want to hear, at behaving in a way that they think you and I would fall for, would think, wow, how good are they? So what we have, not to get depressed about it, what we have is a population, a leadership population, just like the general population, who is filled with people of all different shapes and sizes psychologically. And part of those different shapes and sizes will be that dark triad. And whether they are practicing cognitive empathy, just imagining what I need to say, or feeling it to a degree, is not necessarily in some senses that important, even though I think it's important to know this because it can help you assess individuals and people a little bit more, let's say cautiously, a little bit, with a little bit more insight. So sometimes it necessarily changes things, but what I believe it does is it increases our requirement to practice due diligence, which is to come back to what I've talked about before, to come back to when we look around. I'm sure it's the same in other countries, and certainly in the UK, we've got a by-election. We'll have May elections. We've got the infighting at the top of the Labour Party at the moment, again in the UK, and who to pick, who's best, who to choose. And ultimately, what I think I would suggest is that it is to do with the behaviours. Why have they been behaving that way? How do they act? How do they come across? How much of it looks like it's to do with them, and how much of it looks like it's to do with serving? And then we can introduce some leadership theory and say, okay, what would help us for people to practice who are in high office in the country, whether it's in business, community, and of course politics? And I would suggest it's servant leadership. It's servant leadership. They are there to push us up, to support, not to be up here telling us what to do. Servant leadership tends to be the opposite of authoritarian. It tends to be much more about actually either being really good at cognitive empathy or indeed having effective empathy, feeling how people are feeling, and letting us know, not only by the words, not only by the facial expressions, but by the behaviours. What do they do to help us in those situations? How have they been? What is their track record? There's something that I've talked about again over the years. When someone is promoted or is up for promotion, I urge people to look at what I call the people-centered collateral damage. In other words, what has this individual done to others on the journey? Can we get that information? Is it possible to glean it? Look at how they've behaved. If someone is Machiavellian, with no empathy, and sometimes with a bit of empathy, what have they done? How have they schemed? How have they plotted? Who got damaged? Listen to whistleblowers. Listen to people who've got a different opinion. It may be baloney, it may be made up, but listen to it. We shouldn't dismiss it. We mustn't put anyone on a pedestal because we think, oh, they're going to save us. No, they might not. They might be there just to get into that position. And they don't care. They want the power. They want the prestige. This maybe moves more into the grandiose narcissist, but remember there's overlap. So they can be Machiavellian, narcissistic, and also they can be psychopathic, just focused on them, not feeling in quite the same way. Even, I would suggest, if they have effective empathy. So it's due diligence, it's asking questions, it's looking at the people who are suddenly saying, I believe this now, but I didn't believe it 2 days ago. Is there good reason for that? Maybe there is. Maybe something changed in their lives. Maybe they saw things from a different perspective entirely. But very often when that happens, you can witness it happening. You can say, they did this, and I can see why that changed them. My goodness, they saw the harm that living next to a polluted motorway did, and they wanted to do something about planting trees. Again, I'm making that one up, obviously. But you can see the trail. But if we look back and we see someone who's brutalized individuals within their vicinity, who's acted outrageously, who hasn't cared, who's been callous, who's looked like it was always about them, will they actually have changed? Can we trust that? If 99.9% of their time in that job, in that office, in that role, in that arena has caused chaos, has caused confusion, has caused angst and stress to those around them, can we really believe it when they say, oh, no, 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 no. It's, I will change. I have changed. And I come back to, again, those people who flip-flop, which is part of what I'm saying, but like on a lot of things. So what do you value? It's why I talk about value sets. It's why I talk about beliefs. Because if you don't have that to ground you, and within there, by the way, morals, ethics, if you don't have that to ground you, then you can just change, which is one of the traits of a Machiavellian and certainly a psychopath as well. Say what you need to hear. And when we get that, I'm not saying this individual is necessarily psychopathic or narcissistic or Machiavellian. I'm not saying that. But it doesn't matter whether they have the label or not. If that's what they do, if that's the trend, if that's the tendency, then we have to be extremely cautious. So when we have all these people vying for by-elections, vying for local elections, vying for ultimately general elections, or vying for leadership of the Labour Party, or vying to find a way to get a general election called, whatever it may be, who are they? What's the track record? What do they represent? How have they behaved in the past? And it's not that people can't change. They can evolve. They can get more, mature. They can become more balanced. The brain isn't able to really function properly in terms of dealing with emotions until these days the calculation is 35. It used to be 20. I said when it was 20, it's probably 40. So maybe that 35 number will go up. But yeah, so people will evolve. Of course they will. They will mature. They can mature. Some people can mature. And if that's the case, then we should also see an evolution and a reason why that there has been that change. And so I just worry, and I include me in this mix, that you, me, us, we do not look at someone and go, they're the one. Now, there are a couple of individuals in the UK who I do think, maybe you are. Maybe you are. I am aware they're not perfect. And I don't think it's the least worst. I hope we don't get into that when we've got to choose. I hope it's not that. There are some people who do seem to be a little bit different, but there are other people who are very persuasive, who are out there, who are very eloquent and elegant when they speak. They say the right things. They're very fluent, and they are really quite pleasant to listen to, in the sense that they're not the same as other people. I don't want to name names to bias your thinking. You can make up your mind who you would think of when I talk about that stuff. But certainly, is this a sort of Pied Piper thing? Is it a case of, pouring honey in our ears? Is it a case of, let's just tell you what you want to hear? And in actual fact, it's the wolf in sheep's clothing, and no offense to wolves everywhere at all. So we've got to be careful of that, because remember, in the mix of all of this, whether it's Dark Triad, with or without empathy, effective empathy, whether it is just someone vying for power, a lot of these people, they are trained. It's a bread and butter. What to say, how to avoid answering questions, how to move on to the next subject, how to be resilient, how to just brush off an argument, how to counter-strike, and top of the list for me, how to practice propaganda by the use of language. And again, maybe we'll revisit that one in due course. Let me just check. So it's hopefully is food for thought. I cannot see. I don't think there are any messages that have come up. And if there are, sorry. I tried to get it up on this screen here, but for some reason it wouldn't. But I've got another screen here, and it doesn't look like there are any messages or questions or comments, which is great. And if there were, that's also great. So I hope you found that, because I'm about to finish up, I think, interesting. And as I say, food for thought. I come back to, don't deify any of these people, because there aren't that many deities around. And that crowd, the political classes, there's not one in there, I'm quite convinced. And make sure that you watch their behaviours rather than what they say and how well they say it. What have they done? What's the track record? What are they promising? And to finish off, therefore, going forward, we just need to find ways to be able to track these people and hold them to account. With a deluge of news coming in all the time, they will count on it being, yesterday's chip paper, as we used to say, and it is forgotten about. A week is a long time in politics, a week is a long time in world news. Yes, but some things have got to keep a hold of. Some things have got to say, that you said that. What's happened? How do you account for your progress, lack of progress, going off in the wrong direction? So we have to keep an eye on them. And we have to make sure that we feel that we're being treated fairly, and that they're speaking honestly, and that they're manoeuvring, because they will have to manoeuvre, of course, but their manoeuvrings, well, it's transparent. It's pretty obvious what's going on. I'm not one for cliques, little societies, or clubs. Anyway, I shall sign off. Thank you very much if you've been watching that live. Thank you very much if you subscribe as well. And that's very much appreciated. And we shall speak again soon, so to speak. Apologies again if anybody's commenting or asking a question. It isn't there, not on this other device. If there have been comments, I will find a way to sort that so I can see them next time. So, hope you have a good rest of the day.